Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jace of the Forestry Project. So it's a beautiful time of the year. We're just now getting into April. And one of the cool things that we can start to do is we can start to identify trees. So that's going to be the idea of today's video. Let's start looking at how to identify trees, and more specifically looking at the leaves of trees and their identification. Now, if you want to get more into it, there's an awesome book. This is one of the books that we used in class. I highly recommend it. I will drop a link for it in the comment section of this video, but I highly recommend you check that out, and also look at, we're going to be playing on some picture apps for your phone. So we're gonna start, this video kind of starts breaking into it, looking at leaves, and then next week we'll get at how to use this book, how to use a dichotomous key, and then how to look at picture apps to help you identify trees. So with that, let's get into it. Let's get out on the trail and see what we can identify today. So when you're looking at trees to identify and looking at the leaves specifically, one of the first telltale signs you can start to look at is, does it have a leaf like this American sycamore does, or does it have needles like this longleaf pine? So we can start to use needles versus leaves to actually get into identifying it. Now let's talk about trees that have needles for a second, and how we can differentiate those. So when you're looking at pines, like this longleaf back here, all of the pine needles are going to have a few similarities. Now let's look at it. This is a longleaf pine, and it's going to have your needles, and then right here is your fascicle. And this is what connects your needles to the limb itself. Now, in the South, we have a lot of common trees, and it depends on your geography. A lot of your more common ones are going to be loblolly pine, longleaf pine, slash, shortleaf. Depending on where you are, you can get into pine, spruce pine. If you go further north, you can get into eastern white pine. There's a lot of different ones, and that's just, skimming the surface of them. But here in the South, a lot of your common ones that you see are going to be longleaf or loblolly slash or shortleaf. So loblolly obviously is the most predominant, but there's a few key things that we can look at using the needles to identify what kind of a tree it is. So if we look back at this needle here, the first thing we can start to look at is length. So I don't have a short leaf needle with me, but it would be a lot shorter than this is. Longleaf pine is going to be your longest pine. But you can also see, coming out of this fascicle here are 3 separate needles. Now, your pines in the South that begin with L, longleaf, loblolly, are going to have 3 needles per fascicle. Now, your pines that start with an S, your shortleaf and your slash, are going to have 2 needles per fascicle. So you can use length to differentiate between longleaf and loblolly. Loblolly is going to have a shorter needle than longleaf, but you can also use how many needles per fascicle it has. Now, what if we start to identify trees that are needled leaves, but they're not a pine? So we can also look at eastern red cedar and your cypresses. So let's look at a cypress and kind of start looking at the differences between them and how to tell them apart. Here we have a bald cypress, and its needles are going to look a little bit different. So this is bald cypress, and you can see the needles here, and they're going to be on a flat plane, versus if you had a pond cypress, which is your other species of cypress in the South, and those needles would kind of be wrapped around this little stem here so that they didn't lie on a flat plane. And that's one of the ways you can tell your cypresses apart. Now, another distinction we can make between, say, your pines, your cedars, and then your cypress is how the needles feel. So showed you the cypress needles. I can't find a eastern red cedar here, but they're most all over the place. So if you see one, it's going to have very pointy needles, kind of prickly feeling, versus a bald cypress is not. Now, another thing we can start to look at is just because they have needles, I know we've talked about the pines, the cypress, and the cedar, that does not mean that a needled tree is a conifer. So your cypresses here actually are deciduous. They shed their leaves each year, and you can't always look at that as deciding whether it has needles or not. So outside of needles, what are some other things that we can look for since all the other trees have leaves? There's so many trees with leaves, or what we think about as leaves. How do we tell those apart? And there's two very big distinctions between them, and that's whether they're simple or compound leaves, which is essentially whether it has one leaf coming out for each bud or multiple leaflets that turns into one leaf. And then we can also look at whether it is opposite, alternate, or whorled arrangement of the leaves on the stem. So let's look at whether it's simple or compound and start deciding those differences. Going back to this sycamore here, your simple leaves, like I said, are going to have one leaf per bud, and this is what it looks like. There's a few distinct things we can look at. So this is going to be your leaf body. This center line right there is your midrib, and then this line here is your petiole. So go in between your actual leaf and the stem is your petiole. Now, depending on the tree, sometimes these can have hairs, sometimes they may not have hairs. That can be a deciding factor. I'm not going to dive too much into that today, but on your simple leaves, they're going to fit one of these for each of your individual buds down here. Now, I know as these are younger, they kind of look similar, but once they mature a little bit and grow, you'll be able to tell a lot more differences. Now, let's contrast that to this alder here. So each one of these is not actually a leaf, but a leaflet, and the full thing then becomes a leaf. So what I'm talking about here is you see each one of these little leaf, what we would consider a leaf. So that is actually a leaflet, and this right here is your leaf. So there's some similar features. You have your leaf body. Here's your petiole going in between the leaf, but this in between each of the leaflets is actually called a rachis. And depending on the shape of the rachis, and again, whether it has little hairs or not, you can use that as a deciding factor. Now, that particular tree is what we call pinnately compound. So each one of these is one leaf. Let's think about some of the more common pinnately compound trees, and that's going to be your hickories, your walnuts, your ash, are all going to have those pinnately compound leaves. So you can also get into black locust and, of course, this alder here. Now, if we think about it, if each one of these leaflets came out and had their own leaflets, we would call that bipinnately compound. And let's go look at one of those and see the differences between them. So here is a bipinnately compound leaf, and this is a Japanese silk tree. But if we look, you have each of these coming off, and that is going to be individual leaflets down through here. But if we look down really close, there's no bud down here. But if we go all the way down to here, there is a bud. So not only is this a leaf, but those are your individual leaflets. This whole thing is one leaf. So that is bipinnately compound. Other species that can be bipinnately compound, these are a little bit rare, but your honey locust are bipinnately compound. Now there's other types of compound leaves, and that's going to be your palmately compound and your trifoliate compound. And they can look similar at times, but there's one big distinction, and it's the number of leaves. So trifoliate obviously is going to be 3 leaflets that come out of one spot, and that would be box elder can be a good example of this, and poison ivy. So if you have 3 leaflets coming out and it's a vine, you might want to consider poison ivy, but there's other species that look like that. So let's look at a box elder and see what a trifoliate compound leaf looks like. Here's your box elder, and it can look very similar to poison ivy. But you have your trifoliate leaf here, so this whole thing is the leaf. Here you have your leaflets, your rachis, and then your petiole. So this is a trifoliate leaf. Now sometimes they can get 5 in there. Box elder can be a little bit odd when it's growing, but that's part of what makes it unique. But if you look, that looks kind of similar to poison ivy. Now let's look at something else that is palmately compound that can also look like poison ivy. So here we have Virginia creeper, and you can tell it's Virginia creeper, although it does grow as a vine, and it can have 3 leaves and look like that, fairly similar to poison ivy. It can also have 5 leaves, and that is what makes up the palmately compound. So each of these is a leaflet going into one leaf right there, and you can, this doesn't really have a rachis like the others, but it still has a petiole. So now that we've discussed whether it is simple or compound leaves, now let's look at whether it's opposite, alternate, or whorled leaf arrangement. And what do I mean by that, and how can we use it? So let's look back at the box elder, because this is a very good example of how to tell the difference between species. So if you look at this box elder, and you can see, here's the box elder, so let's look in at these leaves. Now, I discussed earlier that box elder can sometimes kind of be mistaken for poison ivy. But let's look at how you can tell the two apart. So here, if you look at, this is opposite. So each of these stems come out of the, or each of these leaves come opposite from each other, versus if we look at this Virginia creeper here, you can see those are alternate. So one comes out and then it goes up and another one comes out. Now poison ivy is going to be the same. It's going to be alternate, and that's how you can start telling the difference between this box elder here and poison ivy. Now if we look over here, you can start to see what whorled leaves look like. Now all the others kind of came off of a plane, whereas this really doesn't. Leaves are just kind of coming out of everywhere, and they kind of spiral around the plant, and that's where you get your whorled leaf arrangement. Now we've talked about whether they have opposite or alternate leaves, whether the leaves are simple or compound, and even basically just looking at whether the tree has needles or it has what we consider leaf shaped. So now once we start getting past that, if you still need help identifying trees, we can also start to look at leaf shape. And there's a few different common shapes that you'll see in trees, and they can help us determine what kind of tree it is. Now for simplicity, I'm just going to be putting some pictures up of the tree, of the leaf, so that you can see what each of these are, because each of these grow in different conditions, and you would see me walking all over creation trying to find some of these. But they are important, and I want to show you how we can start differentiating among leaf shapes. So let's look at some of the more common leaves. Now first, I do want to preface, leaf shape can differ between trees. Sassafras is a very prime example of this. And if you look at the leaf shape of sassafras, it can either be one of 3 different shapes, and I'm going to get into that in the Management Monday series, but sometimes that can actually help us identify the tree by looking at if it has different leaf shapes. Now, if you want to get more linear leaves like you see here, some of your other trees will be laurel oak or a black willow that will have this type of leaf shape. You can also look more oblong, so it's the same general shape, but it's wider. So this is going to kind of be for your magnolias. Now, once we start looking at how those differ, if the top widens, but the base is narrow, that's going to kind of be a spatula. Think of a spatula, and this is going to be a water oak. And you can see the base is really narrow, the top is really wide, And in just a second, I want to talk about how to identify different oak species apart. And there's a few differentiating things on that. But you can also get into a cordate leaf shape. This is going to be your muscadines, your eastern redbud is also going to have this shape. Now, if they don't round as much at the bottom, that's going to be a deltoid shape, and it'll look more like this cottonwood here. Now, if we start considering the shape of it being wide in the center, but narrow at the ends like a football, we can start to call that elliptical, and then this is going to be your elms and a few other species. And then lastly, there's a few things we can look at between the base of the leaf and the tip of the leaf. So this leaf is a yellow poplar leaf, and it is going to be more of your, almost a kind of a cat-faced leaf. The tulip poplar, they kind of have tulip-looking flowers, but also this leaf is kind of tulip-shaped. Whereas if you have something along the base, you might look at an inequilateral, going back to that elm. This one side is going off slightly more narrow than the other side. So that's another way that we can identify trees. And that's just broadly how leaf shape can start to identify trees. Now, I talked about oaks. Let's look at oaks specifically and see how we might be able to identify between a red oak and a white oak. Different species, this is a chestnut oak, but as you can see, it's got rounded lobes. So we can tell it's in the white oak family. So each of your white oaks are going to have rounded lobes, and each of your red oaks are going to have pointed lobes. Now, if we compare this water oak here to the white oak we saw, if we look down at this lobe here, it comes to a point. Now, water oak can be a little bit different once it matures. The leaves kind of change a little bit, but this point here is going to be true for all of your red oaks. So here is a different water oak. It's a little bit older, more mature. You can see an ant on it, but the lobes have kind of dissipated a little bit, and this is more of your spatulate shape. And you can see that the tips don't have as fine a points, but they're still in the red oak family. Now, another difference between your red oaks and your white oaks is your white oaks are going to drop all of their acorns every year, whereas your red oaks drop half their acorns every year. If you have red oaks in the property, you will see that all through the year they're going to have some acorns. They'll retain them throughout the winter, as your white oak species are going to drop all their acorns in the fall. So that is another determining factor, but that can take some time to identify. That's not as straightforward as looking at the leaves. Now this goes into, you can identify the leaf based off the lobes, which this is almost getting into more of a dentate leaf margin here versus a true lobed. Now here you can see this American chestnut. It has serrated margins. So you can see kind of the serrations going in. Now you can actually have leaves that have doubly serrate margins, and in between each of those serrations would be smaller serrations, and that would be your doubly serrate. But this American chestnut here is serrated margin, and that is another way you can start to identify species apart, is the margins on the leaf. You can also have a few different lobe shapes. So looking at the white oak, it was lobed. Now if we look at the sweet gum here, it is also lobed, but it is palmately lobed. So just like the palmately compound kind of looks like a hand coming out, this lobe here, if we look at the leaf veins, is palmately lobed. And that is a way you can also tell different trees apart. Now this is sweet gum. It is palmately lobed. It's going to have opposite branching, and it's simple. So now we can start to kind of combine everything together when we're identifying these trees. Now, what do we do if the leaf arrangement is the same, the leaf shape is the same, the bark looks similar? We can also start to look at the buds. So if you consider green ash and white ash, they're going to have two completely different leaf scars where the leaf used to sit. And that is one way we can tell the difference. Now, if we also look, there's some different bundle scars here, and we can look at this magnolia. Magnolia family trees have different leaf and bundle scars. So if we look around this leaf, you can see where the leaf comes in. There's your petiole, and it comes in. All around here, this leaf and bundle scar goes 360 degrees all the way around the stem. So that's another way you can start to use your leaf and bundle scars as a way to identify trees. Now, I know I didn't dive fully in depth on all the different trees. This would be way too long of a video if we did, but I hope this is kind of a primer of how to look at leaf shape and the differences in leaf shape, leaf arrangement, margins, all of that stuff, to then start being able to look at. Next week we'll start getting into a dichotomous key, how to use that to identify trees, and then how to start using phone apps to identify trees, some of the pitfalls of using that, but also some of the advantages the phone apps can provide to learners when you're trying to identify trees. So with that, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this video. And if you did, I encourage you, please like this video, leave a comment down below about cool tree things that you use to identify trees with that you think other landowners could benefit from, or other trees that you would like to see me showcase on this channel. Until next time, guys, happy management and God bless.